Hello, THEO 1003, Introduction to Biblical Greek. This week we are talking about voices. And so you've got chapter 15 in your textbook to read and all the practice exercises that go with that. And you've got a set of slides I put up there where I tried to retell the information that's in your textbook in a different way, because I know some things click one way for some people and it takes something else for other people for it to click. But so thirdly, I want to also offer this really short video that just in very general terms talks about what voices even are, in case you're still having trouble clicking into what's going on when we suddenly have middle and passive. So first of all, what is the middle? Most languages have two voices, active and passive. English is one of them. English has active and passive. The sentence we always use is, the dog ate the biscuit. That's active. In fact, everything you've parsed so far has always been in the active voice. So much so that you might think, like, why do I even bother writing active? It seems like everything is active. Well, that's true, because everything we've done so far has been active, except deponent verbs. So, however, there are actually other voices in Greek. In fact, Greek has three voices, active and passive, like English, but also middle. So in our sentence, the dog ate the biscuit, it's active. How could we say that sentence in English, but turned around to be in the passive voice? Active is when the verb is acting on something. Passive is when the verb tells us what is being acted upon. For example, the dog ate the biscuit is active. The biscuit was eaten by the dog is passive. So with the dog ate the biscuit, the dog is in the nominative, the verb is active, and the biscuit is in the accusative because it's getting acted upon. But in a passive sentence, the biscuit, the thing that's getting acted upon, is actually in the nominative. It's the subject of the sentence. It's starting the sentence, the biscuit, and then the verb is passive. Was eaten. That's the verb. And then we can add agency. How was it eaten? Who ate it? Who's doing the eating here? By the dog. That's a phrase that shows who is the agent in this sentence. So the biscuit was eaten. That's a verb in the passive in English. By the dog. So that's all well and good. The dog ate the biscuit, or the biscuit was eaten by the dog. In both cases, you start out with a hungry dog and a biscuit, and you end up with no biscuit and a satisfied dog. What the heck is the middle voice? English doesn't have it, but the middle is something that we sometimes call the reflexive use of language. The middle is a reflexive voice. In English, we make things reflexive by using words like to myself or to themselves, to herself, by myself. So the verb like to dress or to clothe, to put on clothes, you can dress your baby, that's active, but if you dress yourself, well, in English, we just say, I dressed myself. But in some languages that have a middle, you'd put the verb to dress into the middle. And the myself part of it would just be implied by the ending, the middle ending. So Greek has that. It's not very common. It's not very common at all. But how does it look? Well, you've got remember everything you've learned so far about verbs, it's all been active. You've learned like present and future and imperfect and aorist. But you've learned all of it in the active. Well, the verbs have all of those things in the middle, which means new sets of endings, and in the passive, which means new sets of endings again. But you've seen some of these endings already. You've seen the endings because you've learned about deponents. Deponents were, remember, we learned all of our verbs and everything was well and good, and then suddenly I was like, oh, by the way, some verbs have a different style of endings. Those were deponents. So those are the ones that end in omai, like ruomai is our famous one we keep using, as opposed to luo. So those endings that you learned for deponents, those are actually the middle endings. But what's weird about deponents is that they don't have a middle meaning. They mean the exact same way as all the other verbs you've learned mean, actively, and that's what deponents are. They're verbs that use the middle endings in Greek, but they have active meanings. So how do you parse those? Maybe you parse them by saying that they're middle, and some people accept that. Maybe you want to say, no, they're active because they mean actively. Some people accept that. Maybe you just want to explain the voice, in this case, is a deponent voice because it's a little bit active and it's a little bit middle. I accept all of those. You can parse deponents however you want as long as you show me that you know what they are. But what if you came across a verb with those endings, but you knew it wasn't a deponent verb? It's not one of the verbs we learned as deponents. Maybe it would be a regular verb like luo, but with the endings you've already learned. That would be a regular verb like luo that needs to be translated reflexively in the middle voice. Or additionally, with the other set of endings, the passive endings would be a regular verb like luo, but it needs to be translated passively, like the biscuit was eaten by the dog. And now, once you learn, your verb chart has just tripled. You learned all these, you did so amazing. You learned future has a sigma in the stem, but the same endings as the present. You learned aorist has a sigma in the stem too, but an epsilon augment. Imperfect does not have that sigma, but it still has the augment, etc., etc. You got to triple that chart because you've got to learn present and future and aorist, etc. for middle and for passive. You'll find that chart on page 259 of your book. At the end of your book, where you have your charts and it gets into verbs, you'll see, you probably can't see, but you can see that there's your whole active chart, and right underneath it is your whole middle chart, and on the next page is your whole passive chart. So you've just got to learn all of those endings. The good news is that when it comes to the middle, it is not common in Koine. There's just a handful of verbs that even have a middle in Koine. Most of the time when you see middle, it's going to be a verb you recognize as deponent, so you just translate it normally in the active. But once in a while, there's a couple of Koine authors who use verbs that still retain a middle. Middle is more common in older classical Greek, but Koine, Common Greek, doesn't have it much. But the authors who use it a lot would be people like Luke, who are actually trying to sound classier and fancier. So they don't have to use these verbs, but they reach out and try to find older words that still retain a middle, and they use them to sound posh. Yes. So yes, there are a few Koine verbs that have all three voices. You can see them in the active, you can find them in the middle, and you can find them in the passive, and you have to translate them differently accordingly. Endue is active, and it means, she or he is clothing someone else. You would use it for, she is dressing her baby. He is clothing his cat. but it also appears in the middle, and duetai and duetai. He or she is clothing him or herself. And it appears in the passive, and duetai. She, he, or it is being clothed. She's being dressed by someone else, her maidservant, etc. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but we're going to have a real-time chat on Moodle this week. So let's get together there and talk about anything about voices that we don't yet understand, or feel free to email me any questions you have about voices too. And if someone asks a particularly good question and then I explain it well in the answer, I'll send that out as an email or put it on Moodle as well. So what's on Moodle right now for you is slides that explain in detail everything that's in chapter 15, but in a different way. There's also an audio recording I made of your chapter 15 vocab. So you can just play it and I read the Greek, then I wait, then I read the English. So you can test yourself with the little few seconds pause that's between the Greek and the English. You can say like, okay, can I guess this? And just loop that until you know all of the vocab. There's also a crossword puzzle, which I made for chapter 15, and I also uploaded the answers so you can check afterwards if that's helpful. So the plan for this chapter is A, you go through the textbook on your own, especially doing the exercises. And if the exercises take you a long time, the point of the answers being in the back is that you can check your answers and try it again. Keep doing it again and again until it's fast. That's the key. Secondly, go through the revision slides until they make sense and just ask if anything's unclear. And then thirdly is the vocab that's on there. And finally is the crossword puzzle. And then of course there's this video. And if people want to send in specific questions, I'll make another video to answer your specific questions. So in a nutshell, Greek has 3 voices: active, middle, and passive. Voice is something you've got to provide when you're parsing a verb. 9 times out of 10, the voice is going to be active. Most of the things you've learned so far have been active. But whereas English just has active and passive, Greek has active, middle, and passive. The middle endings are the same as your deponent endings. The only difference between a deponent and a middle is that deponent verbs translate actively in the middle, but middle verbs are regular verbs like luo, but they have their deponent endings, so that means they get translated reflexively. So I'll stop for there and let me know if you need to talk more about voice.